The kennels lay beneath the castle like a wound in the earth. Cold stone walls echoed the quiet steps of slaves, and the smell of dampness mixed with the faint scent of herbs and blood. Torches flickered in sconces along the narrow corridors, casting shadows that danced like spirits along the walls. In the heart of this hidden world, the young woman walked carefully, her bare feet brushing against the cold floor. She had been in the kennels for as long as she could remember. The guards had long stopped giving her a name, and the other slaves had learned to speak in whispers. She had a strength that had grown from hardship, a careful courage that kept her alive, yet it was a lonely kind of strength. Friends were dangerous, and trust could be deadly. Her name, whispered once by a nursemaid who had long since disappeared, was Leora. She remembered it only because she whispered it to herself in the dark, as if saying it out loud made it more real. Leora had learned to hide herself in plain sight. She carried herself with a low profile, quiet in voice, careful in every movement. The kennels were not merely for slaves. Some called them a place of punishment, others a place of secrets. No one dared ask too many questions, and those who did were often silenced. Not always by death, but sometimes by fear so complete it reshaped the mind. The air was thick with whispered curses, half-heard stories, and old fears that had become the walls themselves. As Leora moved between the cages, she felt the watchful eyes of the other slaves. Some stared out at her with hope she did not deserve, while others cast their gaze away, afraid to connect. She could hear their soft murmurs about the Alpha King, the ruler of the kingdom above, whose presence was more than legend. Some said he could smell a person's soul and determine if they were destined to serve, or to rise. Others said he had the power to see into one's heart and crush it if it displeased him. Leora had never seen him, except in distant glimpses in the sunlight that occasionally fell through the barred windows above. The stories said he moved like a shadow, quiet, unstoppable, and filled with a power that frightened even the bravest knights. He was cruel, yes, but there was more to him than cruelty, the whispers claimed. There was a part of him no one could touch, a part that the world had left alone. Tonight, as she walked through the dimly lit corridor, Leora felt the air shift. The torches flickered violently, shadows leaping across the walls as if something alive passed among them. Her skin prickled with the sense of a presence that was not human. She froze, her heart beating fast. A sound came from the end of the corridor. It was not the shuffle of the guards or the clatter of chains. It was a quiet, deliberate step, measured and calm. Her breath caught. She looked up. In the shadowed doorway, a figure appeared, tall, cloaked in black, the hood hiding most of his face. But even in shadow he exuded power, the Alpha King. No one had told her to look at him. No one had warned her. Yet when their eyes met, it was as if the world had grown silent. There was a weight to his gaze that pressed against her chest, yet it was not entirely fear. There was something deeper, an instinct ancient and unexplainable that hummed through her bones. The king did not speak. He did not move closer immediately. He simply stood there, scanning the rows of slaves with a calm that made even the guards behind him uneasy. When his gaze landed on Leora, he paused. He breathed in slowly, nostrils flaring. The air around them seemed to thrum with something electric, something neither of them could name. Leora's heart pounded in her ears. She wanted to look away, to shrink into herself, to hide from this terrifying presence. And yet some part of her could not move. She felt drawn to him in a way that was confusing and frightening. The stories, the warnings, the fears, they all seemed distant now. There was only this moment, the weight of his eyes, the pull of a destiny she had never imagined. A guard shifted nervously beside him, clearing his throat. "Your Majesty, these are the slaves for inspection," he said. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly. The king did not reply. Instead, he took another step forward, and the shadows seemed to retreat before him. The other slaves lowered their heads, afraid to breathe, afraid to draw attention. Some whispered prayers to gods long forgotten. Some prayed to live another day. But Leora, though afraid, felt a strange defiance in her chest. She had survived much worse than fear before. She would survive this too, though she did not yet understand how. The king stopped directly in front of her. She could now see the faint glow of his eyes beneath the hood, a deep golden color that seemed to pierce through layers of stone, iron, and fear. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He simply looked, and she felt the air shift with every heartbeat. A soft wind stirred in the corridor, though the torches did not move. And then, as if drawn by some unseen bond, the king extended a single hand, not in command, not in threat, but in recognition. The scent of him, rich, wild, and intoxicating, filled the space around her. She realized then with a mix of terror and awe that this was no ordinary inspection. This was something deeper, something eternal. The other slaves murmured among themselves, some gasping, some stepping back, but Leora could not hear them. Her mind was focused on one thing, the king, standing before her, calm and commanding, yet uncharacteristically still, as if he too were caught in the invisible threads that connected them. Then, without warning, a soft voice, almost a whisper, filled the corridor. It was not the king's voice entirely, but something carried on the air. "The mate is among us," Leora's breath caught in her throat. She could not understand it, but the words felt like fire on her skin. Her heart thundered. Her body felt alive in a way it had never felt before. Fear and awe twisted together, knotting tightly in her chest. The king's eyes never left hers. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his head as if smelling the air around her again, confirming what the whispers of prophecy had foretold. Leora felt a strange heat bloom inside her, a mixture of longing, fear, and disbelief. She wanted to run. She wanted to hide. But something inside her knew she could not now. Not when destiny had come in the form of this silent, commanding figure. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, the king withdrew, stepping back into the shadows. The torchlight flickered again, leaving the corridor bathed in quiet, trembling silence. Leora's knees weakened and she sank onto the cold stone floor, gasping for breath. The other slaves looked at her with wide eyes, uncertain whether to approach or flee. A guard cleared his throat nervously. "Your Majesty has finished his inspection. Return to your quarters." His voice trembled. Leora nodded, though her mind was a storm. She felt as if a thread had been pulled in her soul, one that would not let go. She did not know what would happen next. She did not know if she would survive another day in the kennels, or if the king's attention had marked her for something beyond her understanding. As she curled into a corner for the night, her thoughts raced. The air seemed to hum with magic, whispers of old prophecies and the unspoken truth of fate. Somewhere above, the castle was alive with candles, voices and power, but below, in the cold and shadow, a connection had been forged, silent, invisible, undeniable, and the Alpha King had smelled his mate. The castle seemed quieter than usual that evening, but the silence was heavy, not peaceful. Shadows clung to the corners of the corridors, stretching along the walls like dark fingers. Leora moved carefully through the kennels, carrying a small basket of food for the animals, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She could feel the king's presence lingering, even when he was not near. Every step she took seemed watched, every breath measured. Though she had never spoken to him freely, she could feel the pull between them growing stronger. It was not just fear that bound her. It was fascination, curiosity, and a strange sense of destiny that made her heart ache. She wanted to look away, to retreat into the safety of her routines, but something in her stirred, a courage that had been buried deep beneath years of servitude. The king appeared without warning, as if summoned by her own racing thoughts. He stood silently in the doorway, his golden eyes fixed on her. She froze, feeling the heat of his gaze brush against her like a tangible thing. "You move with skill," he said softly, his voice filling the corridor. "But skill alone is not enough. You must learn to read the world around you, to anticipate, to act before the danger reaches you." Leora nodded, though she did not fully understand. She had survived countless trials by hiding and obeying, not by predicting threats or reading the intentions of others. Yet the king's words stirred something within her, a desire to rise beyond the walls of the kennels, to claim even a small portion of power over her own fate. He stepped closer, and she caught the faint scent of him once more, the wild, commanding aroma that had first drawn her attention. Her pulse quickened. She wanted to pull back, but her body betrayed her. The tension between them was undeniable, a magnetic force that neither could resist. "You will not speak unless spoken to," he reminded her, his voice gentle yet firm. "Do not mistake my interest for leniency. The world outside these walls is merciless, and so am I." Fear surged through her, but beneath it a quiet defiance began to grow. She realized that she did not have to be a slave only in body. She could be a survivor in spirit too, and maybe, just maybe, she could teach the king something about humanity, about courage and strength born from adversity. The following days were filled with quiet lessons. The king watched her from the shadows as she worked, noting her small acts of cleverness, the way she anticipated the animal's needs, the subtle gestures that kept the other slaves calm, the clever solutions she devised to avoid the guard's harsh scrutiny. He began to test her, presenting challenges that seemed simple but required thought, patience, and courage to solve. One afternoon, he brought her to the outer courtyard, a place few slaves were allowed. The sunlight fell on the stone, warm against her skin, and she could see the gardens beyond, twisted but alive, a mixture of beauty and danger. Today, he said, you will learn to move with purpose, not just survival. Leora nodded, gripping the basket in her hands. She followed him as he led her through the gardens, showing her paths, hidden corners, and obstacles she would have missed. Each step was a test, each glance a challenge. He observed her closely, noting hesitation, mistakes, and courage. "Why do you push me so hard?" she asked finally, unable to keep the question in her chest. The king did not answer immediately. He simply walked beside her, silent, watching. Then finally he spoke, his voice softer than before. "Because you must survive what comes, and because I see more in you than you know. Courage alone will not save you. Understanding, cleverness, and spirit will. You have the spark. I will see if you can carry it into fire." His words struck her deeply. They were not praise, not command, not encouragement, yet all of them at once. She realized she had never been seen like this before, not for what she could endure, but for what she could become. As they moved deeper into the gardens, a shadow shifted among the trees. Leora froze, her instincts alert. Before she could react, the king stepped forward, his hand lifting slightly as if drawing power from the air. A figure emerged from the darkness, an armed intruder, clearly sent to test the king or perhaps to spy. The king did not flinch, but his eyes narrowed. Leora's heart pounded. This was her first true confrontation with danger outside the kennels. Her mind raced, recalling everything she had learned from observation and instinct. "Stay behind me," he commanded. But there was no fear in his voice, only trust. A trust that she felt she could not betray. The intruder advanced, but the king's presence alone seemed to ripple through the courtyard, bending light and shadow as if the air itself obeyed him. Leora felt a sudden clarity. She could act. She could move. She could survive. Her hands moved to throw a small net, used for catching unruly animals, and with a precise flick, it tangled the intruder's legs. Surprised and off balance, the intruder fell. The king's golden eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw more than recognition. She saw respect. "You are sharper than I imagined," he said, his voice quiet, almost approving. "But this is only the beginning. The world beyond these walls will demand more than cleverness. It will demand heart, strength, and the will to act even when fear presses like iron." Leora felt a mixture of pride and fear. She had succeeded in a way she had never imagined. Yet she also understood that the bond forming between them carried consequences she could not predict. Her life was no longer her own. Every action was now linked to the king's will, to destiny, and to the invisible thread that had drawn them together. That evening, she returned to the kennels with a restless mind. The other slaves avoided her gaze, sensing the shift, sensing that something had changed. Leora curled into a corner of her small sleeping area, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the king's presence even when he was not near. She had survived, yes, but she had also been seen, truly seen, in a way that frightened and thrilled her. Sleep came fitfully. Dreams of golden eyes and shadowed corridors haunted her, mingling with visions of the intruder, the gardens, and the strange magnetic pull of destiny. She awoke several times, each time feeling the lingering heat of his attention as if he were close, watching, waiting. The next day the king called for her again. This time he led her to a hidden chamber beneath the castle. The walls were lined with ancient tomes, and the air was thick with the scent of old parchment and magic. Leora could feel the power here, raw and ancient, a force that had existed long before the castle itself. "You must learn more than survival," he said, his gaze sweeping over her. "You must learn to understand power, its weight, its cost, and its responsibility. Only then can you truly walk beside me," She nodded, trying to steady her racing heart. Every word he spoke carried a mixture of command and challenge, urging her to grow beyond the limitations of her past. She realized that this was no longer just about avoiding cruelty or punishment. This was about transformation, about becoming someone who could face the world with courage and clarity. Hours passed as he showed her the hidden knowledge of the castle, secrets of movement, observation, and influence. Leora absorbed it all, her mind sharp, her senses alert. She felt herself changing, awakening to a potential she had never imagined. The king's presence was constant, a quiet but undeniable pressure that shaped her thoughts and actions. By evening, exhaustion weighed on her, but also a strange exhilaration. She had survived the day's tests, learned new skills, and felt the invisible tether between herself and the king grow stronger. Fear and desire intertwined, creating a tension she could neither escape nor deny. As she lay on the cold stone floor that night, her mind replayed every moment, every glance, every word. She knew she was changing, evolving, but she also understood that danger was never far. The world outside the kennels was cruel, and her bond with the king would make her a target as much as it made her powerful. Somewhere in the shadows, the king's eyes watched, golden and unyielding, assessing her growth, her courage, and her heart. Leora realized with a mixture of dread and longing that nothing would ever be the same again. The morning in the kennels was unusually silent. Even the guards moved with careful precision, as if the castle itself had sensed the shift that had occurred the night before. Leora's hands were raw from the cold stone floor, and her mind raced with the memory of the king's gaze. Every glance, every breath he had taken near her, had left a mark she could not erase. She kept her head down as she moved along the rows of cages, but the other slaves looked at her differently now. Some whispered with hope, others with fear, as if they sensed she had been chosen. Leora did not know what to think. She had survived for years by hiding, by staying small, by making herself invisible. Yet now the invisible thread that connected her to the Alpha King pulsed strongly, making her aware of a destiny she could neither ignore nor understand. The day passed in a blur of routine. She fed the animals, swept the floors, and endured the cold stares of guards who knew little but could punish freely. But she could not shake the memory of the shadowed figure in the corridor, the golden eyes that seemed to see through stone, steel, and fear. Late in the afternoon, a hush fell over the kennels. Leora sensed it before she saw it, the presence of the king. This time he did not appear from the shadows. He stepped forward into the torchlight, his movements deliberate and calm. Every step he took seemed to command the air itself, bending it to his will. The other slaves immediately crouched or bowed, their fear tangible, but Leora remained still. He stopped in front of her. There was no pretense this time, no hidden glance or cautious distance. He was closer now, and she could see the fine lines of his face, the strength in his jaw, the depth of his eyes. He studied her silently, nostrils flaring as if tasting the air, and then he spoke. Not in command, but in a voice low and calm, like a river flowing over stone. "You are not like the others," he said. The words were simple, yet the power behind them made her chest tighten. "You carry something that cannot be hidden." Leora felt heat rise to her cheeks. She wanted to deny it, to explain that she was nothing, that she was merely a servant of the kennels, nothing more. But even as she opened her mouth, the words caught in her throat. She could not speak. The weight of his presence, of recognition, pressed down on her like the heaviest stone. The king circled her slowly, each step measured, deliberate. He did not touch her, yet she could feel the pull of his presence in every inch of space between them. She realized then that this was no ordinary inspection. This was a test, a reading of her spirit, a weighing of her heart. "You have survived much," he said finally, stopping in front of her again. "Yet survival alone does not mark you. There is fire in you, courage, intelligence, and something more, something that belongs to me." The word struck her like a blade. Belongs to him. She wanted to pull back to escape, but some invisible tether held her in place. She did not understand it, and fear and fascination swirled together in her chest. "You do not yet understand," he continued, his voice softer now, almost gentle, though it carried the same undeniable authority. "You will in time. But the choice is not yours alone." Leora swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. Her mind raced. Choice, bond, destiny? She had lived her whole life without power, without hope, without the chance to make decisions that mattered. And now, fate seemed to be dragging her into a world she could neither predict nor refuse. The king leaned slightly closer, and she caught a hint of his scent, the same scent that had pulled at her the night before. It was rich and wild, like the forest after rain, like the wind that carried ancient secrets. It filled her senses and made her heart beat faster. "You will not speak unless spoken to," he said suddenly, pulling back to his full height. "And you will follow my instructions. Anything else will have consequences." Fear surged through Leora, but beneath it was another feeling. Curiosity, fascination, something dangerous and thrilling that she had never experienced. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and he studied her for a long moment before stepping back into the shadows. The day stretched on, but Leora could not focus on work. Her mind kept returning to him, the king, the alpha, the man who smelled her as if he had known her for a lifetime. She realized with a mixture of dread and longing that she could not ignore him. Not now, not ever. That night she lay on the cold stone floor, staring at the ceiling of the kennel, listening to the distant sounds of the castle above. Her thoughts were filled with him, with the way he had looked at her, the way he had circled her as if measuring every inch of her soul. She had always believed survival was the only goal that mattered. Now she understood that something else was at stake, something far more dangerous. The following day he returned. This time he brought a task. He did not speak much, only observing her as she moved through the routine he had set. Every movement she made was watched, every decision noted. And yet there was a strange tension in the air, a mixture of expectation and restraint. "You are clever," he said at one point, his voice almost a whisper. "You learn quickly. You adapt. You survive. And yet," he trailed off, letting the word hang in the air like smoke, "you are not complete." Leora did not understand what he meant. She had survived, adapted, learned the rules of this cruel world. Yet she felt as if he had seen something she had never seen in herself, a spark, a potential, a part of her that had been waiting to awaken. Days passed like this, each encounter more intense than the last. The king's presence was constant, though unseen most of the time, and Leora felt herself changing. She noticed details she had ignored before, the way the torches flickered when he passed, the quiet shifting of the guards, the almost imperceptible tremor in the air when he was near. She realized with a mixture of fear and awe that he commanded not just people, but the very space around him. And yet he also revealed something unexpected. In small, subtle ways he protected her. A guard who was too rough would receive a warning glance that chilled him to the bone. A task that seemed impossible would be adjusted, just enough for her to succeed. She began to sense a contradiction in him, a ruler who could be merciless, yet chose carefully to shield her in ways no one else could. One evening, as the sun set behind the castle towers, painting the stone walls in hues of fire and shadow, he approached her again. The air was warmer now, charged with tension, as if the world itself had shifted in anticipation. "You are stronger than you know," he said, his voice low, almost intimate. "But strength alone will not keep you safe. You must learn to trust, to see beyond fear, to act with purpose." Leora's hands trembled. She had never been told to trust anyone, not in her life. Trust had always been a liability, a weakness, yet somehow she felt compelled to believe him, even though fear still gnawed at her heart. "Do you understand?" he asked, his eyes locking onto hers. There was no command in the question, only expectation. She nodded. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. A moment of silence followed, heavy with unspoken words. Then, as always, he stepped back, melting into the shadows, leaving her alone with the hum of magic, the distant murmur of the castle above, and her own racing thoughts. That night, sleep was impossible. Leora lay awake, listening to the quiet steps of the guards, the distant howl of the wind against the stone walls, and the echo of his words. She thought of the spark he had seen in her, of the bond that had been recognized without consent, and of the future she could not yet imagine. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. She did not know if she would survive or if the bond he had sensed would be a blessing or a curse. But she knew one thing: her life had changed forever. The Alpha King had smelled his mate, and destiny had begun its silent, relentless pull. The castle trembled in the night. A low wind rattled the torch sconces along the stone walls, carrying whispers of danger that made even the bravest guards shiver. Leora moved carefully through the corridors of the kennels, every sense alert. The hum she had heard the night before had grown louder, more insistent, and her instincts told her that the danger was very close. The Alpha King appeared as always, emerging from the shadows with that quiet, commanding presence that had become a part of her life. His golden eyes scanned the corridors, assessing the threat, his every movement precise and deliberate. For the first time, Leora felt less like a slave and more like an equal, an ally, a part of something far greater than herself. "The intruder is near," he said, his voice low and calm, though his body was tense, ready for whatever might come. "Tonight you will face a choice. Courage alone will not save you. You must trust me and yourself in equal measure." Leora nodded, gripping the small dagger she had been given for protection. Her pulse pounded in her ears, but she felt a strange clarity. She had learned much from him, the lessons of observation, of action, of courage tempered by intelligence. Tonight she would need all of it. From the shadows a figure emerged. Cloaked in darkness, the intruder stepped forward with a deliberate menace, radiating a power that chilled the air. Leora's heart raced, but she stood her ground. The king moved beside her, close enough that she felt the heat of his presence, the unspoken bond between them anchoring her courage. "You will not pass," the king said, voice echoing with authority that made the stone walls tremble. The intruder laughed softly, a sound that sent shivers down Leora's spine. "You think you can protect her? You are strong, yes, but alone you are still mortal." The king did not move, but his eyes glowed brighter, golden light reflecting against the stone walls. Leora felt the energy in the air shift, as if the very castle responded to his command. It was then she realized the truth. He was not merely a man, not merely a king. He was a force of nature, and together they could face the darkness. The intruder lunged. The king moved with astonishing speed, placing himself between Leora and the attack. The force of his presence alone seemed to push the intruder back, though the figure's dark energy lashed against him. Leora's mind raced, remembering everything she had learned from him. She could not fight like him, but she could act with precision, and she could support him. With careful timing, she moved to flank the intruder, using the dagger to deflect a dark tendril that lashed toward the king. He glanced at her, a flicker of approval in his eyes, and she felt the invisible tether between them pulse stronger than ever. Their connection was no longer subtle, it was tangible, a bond forged in fire, shadow, and trust. The intruder hissed in frustration, circling them, but the king's presence held steady. Leora noticed a small, glowing sigil etched into the stone floor beneath the intruder's feet. She realized quickly that it was the source of his dark energy, a focus for his power. Acting on instinct and the lessons she had learned, she moved toward it, careful to stay out of reach of the dark tendrils. With a swift, precise motion, she struck the sigil with her dagger. The glow faltered, then dimmed, and the intruder shrieked in anger and surprise. The king surged forward, his golden energy flaring, and with a single movement he banished the intruder into the shadows. The sound of the being's retreat echoed through the corridors, leaving a stunned silence behind. Leora's hands trembled, but a deep sense of triumph filled her chest. She had acted with courage, with thought, with the knowledge the king had shared, and he had been there beside her, their bond undeniable. The king turned to her, his expression softening for the first time in days. He reached out, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You were brave," he said, his voice low, almost tender. "Not because you were unafraid, but because you acted despite fear. That is strength. That is fire." Leora met his gaze, her chest tight with a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. "I could not have done it without you," she admitted softly. "No," he said, shaking his head slightly. "You could not have done it without yourself. I only showed you the path. You walked it. You survived the test." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. She realized then that she was no longer the same Leora who had arrived in the kennels, cowering in the shadows. She had grown, transformed, shaped by fire, by fear, and by the unspoken bond with the Alpha King. They walked through the castle together, no longer master and slave, but allies bound by trust and destiny. Leora could feel the weight of the bond, the silent promise of protection, the pull of something ancient and inevitable. She knew that their lives would never be simple again. Danger would always linger, as would the responsibilities of power. but she also knew that together they could face anything. The following morning, the sun rose over the castle in pale gold, illuminating the stone walls and gardens. Leora stood on a balcony, feeling the warmth of the sunlight on her skin for the first time in weeks. The king appeared beside her, silent as ever, and together they watched the world awaken. "You have changed," he said softly, his gaze on her, not just in skill or courage, but in spirit. "You are ready for what comes next." Leora nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I feel stronger," she admitted. "And I feel connected. To you and to the world outside." He looked at her, golden eyes intense yet softer than she had ever seen. "And so the bond is complete," he said. "You are no longer merely my mate in prophecy. You are my partner in purpose, my equal in courage, my fire in shadow." Her heart swelled with a mix of awe, relief, and a strange, unspoken longing. The bond between them was no longer invisible or uncertain. It was solid, unshakable, forged in trials, shadows, and shared courage. A distant bell tolled from the castle tower, signaling the morning and the continuing rhythm of life in the kingdom. Leora knew that challenges would come, that danger would return, but for the first time she felt ready. She had survived the kennels, the tests, the shadows, and the intruder, and now she would survive whatever came with the Alpha King by her side. He placed a hand on her shoulder again, firm but gentle, a silent affirmation of their bond. "Rest now," he said. "Tomorrow the world begins again and you will walk beside me. Fear may come, danger may return, but together, we are unstoppable." Leora closed her eyes, letting the warmth of his presence, the security of their bond, and the strength she had found within herself fill her. For the first time in her life she felt whole, no longer a slave in the kennels, no longer defined by fear. She was chosen, not for submission, but for courage, for strength, for destiny. And as the sunlight bathed them in gold, she understood the truth. She was no longer merely surviving. She was alive with him. The castle seemed alive that night, though it was not warmth that stirred its walls. Shadows stretched across corridors, twisting in the flickering torchlight, and the cold stone whispered of secrets older than any living soul. Leora moved carefully, her hands brushing against the walls for guidance. Even after days in the kennels, the castle still felt vast, unwelcoming, and dangerous. But she no longer walked with only fear. The days under the Alpha King's watch had changed her. She had begun to notice small details, to anticipate dangers, to act with a confidence born of careful observation. The fire in her chest had grown stronger, and she could feel her own power emerging even in the shadow of the king. He found her in the library that evening. The chamber was large, lined with ancient tomes and scrolls. Dust floated in the air, catching the torchlight like tiny stars. Leora froze when she saw him step from the shadows, not because of fear, but because of the intensity in his golden eyes. They held her in place, silent, commanding, yet strangely gentle. "You are restless," he said softly, moving closer. His presence was like gravity, pulling at her very soul. "Your mind does not rest even when your body does. You think, you observe, you grow. That is both your strength and your danger." Leora swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. His words were not questions, not orders. They were observations, truths she could not deny. She felt exposed under his gaze, yet strangely unafraid. "You have seen only the surface of this world," he continued, circling slowly, like a predator aware of every heartbeat around him. "The castle is not all danger and cruelty. There is power here, ancient and deadly, and soon you will understand that what you survive is only part of what will define you." Her chest tightened at his words. She had survived countless trials in the kennels, yet she understood that they were only preparation. The real test was beginning, one that would not only challenge her courage but also her heart. The king stopped before her, and for a moment there was silence. The torchlight danced across his face, revealing the faintest cracks in the armor of his stern expression. Leora noticed it, though she could not have named what she saw. A flicker of hesitation, a vulnerability beneath the dominant presence he always carried. "You have strength," he said finally, softer now, almost a whisper, "but strength alone cannot protect you. You must learn to trust even when the world demands obedience and fear." The word struck her deeply. Trust was a foreign concept. In the kennels, survival had been her only teacher. Yet here, in this quiet chamber filled with the weight of history, she felt the stirrings of something new. Courage was no longer enough. She had to understand loyalty, power, and the strange pull of connection that the king represented. He stepped closer, and she caught his scent again, the same wild, commanding presence that had first drawn her attention. Her heart raced, but she did not pull back. She could feel the invisible tether between them, stronger now, pulling her forward and binding them together in ways neither could resist. "I have never met anyone like you," he admitted, his voice lower now, filled with a rare honesty. "You are more than survival, more than defiance. There is fire in you that I did not expect to find." Leora's hands trembled. She wanted to speak, to protest, to deny that she was special, but the words would not come. She realized, with a mixture of awe and fear, that she did not need to speak. He saw her, truly saw her, in a way that no one else ever had. A sudden noise shattered the quiet. The library doors creaked and a shadow flitted across the room. Leora's instincts went immediately into action. Her heart pounded as she moved closer to the king, ready to follow his lead. But he did not flinch. His eyes narrowed, golden and sharp, as he assessed the intruder. With a flick of his hand, a surge of power rippled through the air, and the shadow froze, revealing a figure cloaked in dark robes. Leora's breath caught. This was no ordinary spy. This presence radiated danger. The king's voice was calm but deadly. "You are far from welcome," he said, and the intruder froze in place, sensing the force behind his words. Leora felt a shiver run through her. The air itself seemed to bend to the king's will, and she realized just how formidable he truly was. The figure retreated slightly, then vanished into the shadows. The moment passed, leaving the library quiet once more. Leora's hands were trembling, and the king's golden eyes lingered on her for a long moment, as if assessing not just her courage, but her understanding of what had just happened. "You must learn more than survival," he said, finally breaking the silence. "You must learn to act with purpose, even when fear presses like stone, and you must learn to face the darkness without flinching, because it will not leave you." Leora nodded, swallowing hard. She realized that this was no longer just about obeying, about surviving the harshness of the kennels. This was about transformation. She had been seen, recognized, and challenged in ways she had never imagined. "Will you guide me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She had never asked for anything before, never dared to hope that someone might see her worth beyond her survival. The king's gaze softened, though his posture remained commanding. "I do not guide those who are unwilling," he said. "But I see your potential. You may yet become someone who walks beside me, not behind me." The words sent a thrill through her chest, mingled with fear and uncertainty. To walk beside the Alpha King, to share in his power and his destiny, was a dangerous path, but it was one she could not ignore. They spent hours in the library that night. He showed her ancient tomes, teaching her the secrets of observation, strategy, and influence. She learned to notice what others overlooked, to anticipate danger, and to act decisively. Every lesson was a test, every glance from him a silent measurement of her growth. As the night deepened, the bond between them grew. It was not spoken aloud, but in the subtle touches of their hands passing a book, in the shared glances over a map, in the quiet acknowledgement of trust forming between them. Leora felt herself changing, her fear giving way to understanding, her caution mingling with courage. Finally, when the torches burned low and the shadows stretched long, he stepped back, allowing her to leave. She walked through the corridors of the castle with a strange lightness in her chest, though the weight of responsibility pressed on her shoulders. She understood now that her survival was only the beginning. The bond with the king had set her on a path that would demand everything she had: heart, mind, and spirit. Leora curled into her small sleeping area later that night, her mind racing with everything that had happened. The king's words, the shadowed intruder, the lessons in the library, all of it had left her changed. She felt the invisible tether between them, stronger now, a pull she could not resist. Fear and longing twisted together, creating a tension that kept her awake. Somewhere in the castle she sensed him watching, as he always did, assessing her growth and courage. She realized that the bond between them was no longer just a legend whispered in the halls. It was real. It was dangerous. It was powerful, and it was only the beginning.